Episode of Season 9 of the Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I am Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend and business partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Ray.
What's on the agenda today, Graham?
Ray, well, I've been taking things a little bit easier, as you know, but the world of financial crime and defences has not stopped moving.
Oh, how inconsiderate.
Well, quite. But a few papers and updates have come through, and I don't think we'd criticise anyone who hasn't quite managed to get across these yet. But there are some which have useful insights I think we can share and help folks get quickly up to speed.
Now that sounds useful. What specific updates are we thinking of, Graham?
Ray, I have got three specific updates that I'm thinking of. Now, first of all, there's Wolfsberg new version of their principles for correspondent banking. And then there's the revised FATF grey list. Always like grey list if you're called Graham. And finally, we have the Finnish FSA's new guidance on risk assessments.
You put those in increasing order of interest, I'd say.
Always save the best till last, Ray. Always save the best till last.
Right then, well, let's kick off with Wolfsberg, which has returned its gaze to correspondent banking.
Now, returned, you say?
Yeah, I suspect our listeners will know of Wolfsberg's 2014 AML Principles for Correspondent Banking and their FAQ for Correspondent Banking from the same year.
Yes, and they may well also have listened to episode 4 of season 3. Do you remember that long ago, Ray? This podcast. In fact, it was, if I recall, about 3 years ago.
It was.
Where we gave our own introduction to correspondent banking.
It's still available in your podcast app of choice, listeners.
Well, indeed it is. But Wolfsberg haven't been quiet in the space since 2014 either, have they?
No, they launched their CBDDQ, which is a dreadful Scrabble hand. Also, Correspondent Banking Due Diligence Questionnaire, which updated the old Correspondence Banking Questionnaire. They made that update in 2018.
And very detailed it is. So now they've issued updated guidance. What's your review of it then, Ray?
Well, if I'm honest, Graham, I think I'd say underwhelming.
Oh, I thought so too. So why do you say so?
Well, if you read the 2022 and the 2014 principles and FAQs side by side, and I've done this for you.
Thank you.
There's very little new or amended content, to the point that I might have been tempted, were I in a decision-making role at Wolfsberg, not to have bothered.
But, given that you have compared the two versions, Ray, can you run through the new bits?
Well, sure. First, as a general point, the principles have kind of rebranded from AML to financial crime compliance, which reflects the CBDDQ's wide-ranging coverage of all financial crime risk management.
Well, that seems sensible. What else?
There's explicit inclusion of specific correspondent relationships outside of traditional correspondent banking, with the principles specifically citing institutions like PSPs and VASPs.
And actually, Ray, I suspect that's the point that probably justifies publication of the update. Clear clarification that scope extends to these fintechs when they are clients.
Well, I think you may be right, actually. Even the 2014 principles urged banks to look at non-bank financial institutions, but it wasn't explicit in terms of which specific types. And some people might find this clarification helpful.
One other new bit that jumped out at me, Ray, was the new paragraph on risk appetite. There's guidance that the bank should define its correspondent banking risk appetite and have it approved by the board.
Yeah, and the risk appetite should specify Specific activity. That's a bit tautologous, isn't it?
Yeah.
Should note specific activity or parties the bank wants to prohibit or limit being processed through its accounts. And this should be communicated internally and to respondent customers.
I imagine that's already in place at most banks undertaking correspondent banking anyway. But it's useful to have it set as an expectation.
And among a few minor updates, I did find one sentence quite interesting.
Well, I thought you probably would. Which one?
Well, I think the pandemic experience was in the minds of the authors when they added at the end of the section advocating customer visits that institutions should make risk-based decisions on measures to take if a customer visit is not possible.
Oh, yes. As of course it may not have been during the past year or two.
Yeah, quite. The very last section of the paper is new, a short section headed, What should the institution expect from the respondent?
Okay, and what should they then, Ray?
Partnership by way of clear and open communication, timely and accurate responses to requests for information, and an understanding of and adherence to the aforementioned risk appetite.
And there, I think, we have in one place the elements on which the relationship will stand or fall in the long term.
I think that's right. And the principals position these elements as ones that the institution will want to monitor on an ongoing basis.
Pretty good, Ray. And despite some new content, I don't think this update from Wolfsberg casts much of a new light on correspondent banking, and nor does it establish principles that weren't already best practice.
Oh, no.
Except there is a single word in the document that I think is really significant.
What's that, Graham?
Well, the 2014 FAQ includes this wording, and I'm quoting, "The institution may have no direct relationship with the underlying parties to any transaction route through it, and in such cases may not be in a position to verify identity or to understand fully the nature of the specific transaction."
Okay, so how's that different in the new document?
It changes may not to will not. It, quote, will not be in a position to verify identity or to understand fully the nature of the specific transaction.
Yeah, that does seem quite significant.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's an explicit recognition of a difficult reality. And alongside the new stuff around communicating your risk appetite, really focuses the attention on the reliance you are placing on the respondent and their own controls.
Okay, so on to FATF's update then. This follows their plenary in October. We've got a couple of countries removed from the grey list and 3 added. First of all, Graham, let's just recap. What is the grey list?
Well, it's the FATF's naughty step, Ray.
And why is it grey rather than black?
The blacklist is a very short one of countries you might consider utterly beyond the pale, Ray. FATF regard them as having, quote, significant strategic deficiencies in their regimes to counter money laundering, terrorist financing and financing of proliferation, end quote. There are currently just 2 nations on that list, DPRK and Iran.
Gotcha. So the grey list then, I'll bet FATF don't call it the naughty step, do they?
No, sadly not. I think they should, though. No, according to FATF, these are, I'm quoting again, jurisdictions under increased monitoring that are actively working with the FATF to address strategic deficiencies in their regimes to counter money laundering, terrorism financing and proliferation financing.
Actively working with, gotcha. Now, are there many of these?
Well, they're usually about 25. Now, in October, Nicaragua and Pakistan came off the list, while the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mozambique and Tanzania were added to it.
And coming off it suggests the jurisdiction has addressed FATF's concerns?
Well, yes, to some extent.
Okay, well, great. So what's the significance of this list, Graham?
Well, it depends where you're working out of, Ray. In much of the world, it's just another input to your country risk list. But if you're in Europe, it is more significant.
Indeed it is. In the EU, EEA and in the UK, there's a thing called the List of High-Risk Third Countries, where if a client is based in one of those countries or transactions are made involving one of those countries, it's mandatory by law to apply EDD.
But that's not the same as the grey list, is it?
Well, technically no. For the EU and EEA, it's the list published by the European Commission that sets the EDD requirement. That's not a direct match with the grey list, but the grey list is very much the basis for the European Commission list, with perhaps a 25% variance typically. If you're in the UK, though, it is the same list. The UK list is maintained by His Majesty's Treasury, who simply take the unedited FATF list.
Nice use of His Majesty's Treasury there, Ray. Still not quite used to it.
No, it's going to feel weird for a while, isn't it?
Getting there, I think, yes. And HMT, I'm going to avoid the trap, they do it quite quickly, don't they?
Yeah, they do. This time it was about 3 weeks between FATF publishing the new grey list and HMT updating theirs for UK regulated firms to start applying the new list immediately.
And what about the European Commission?
Well, it takes them longer typically to produce their moderated list, but all member states have legislation that simply refers to that single list, so there's no delay for implementation at a state level.
Okay, sticking with the UK, I see there's some useful accompanying guidance with the new list this time.
There is, Graham. It goes into what's expected when you have existing customers who are affected by their home country being added to the list.
Well, yeah, so what's the upshot?
Well, there's a requirement to review all cases, Graham, with particular regard to the factors that place the country on the FATF list and consideration of how these might be relevant to the specific relationship and to what extent additional EDD is required where this isn't already on file.
Okay, but there had to be some EDD of some description. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a legal requirement in the UK and across the EU.
Gotcha. So there might be a few regional banks in particular whose UK and EU branches will be quite busy this month.
Well, I'd say so, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Now, Ray, what have the Finnish FSA been up to?
Well, in October, they released their summary risk assessment for the credit institution sector in Finland. And I think there's some interesting content that I'd regard as guidance for anyone putting together a business-wide risk assessment for their own firm in this sector, whether that's in Finland or anywhere else.
Well, that sounds jolly good. Now, where does this sit in the hierarchy of risk assessments firms are required to refer to, Ray?
Well, first, let's look at what that hierarchy is. We covered this way back in Season 3 again.
Wow, Season 3. Anyway, it begins with a national risk assessment, which is prepared by the government, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the UK, for example, that's handled by the Treasury and the Home Office. And the output from that allows the government to consider the adequacy of current legal and regulatory rules and powers and to allocate a risk-based budget to different threats.
Next, there's the risk assessment by supervisory authorities, which assesses the risks they have responsibility for in the light of the government's assessment and other relevant international reports and guidelines. And that's where this assessment from the Finnish FSA sits, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And as such, it's a key input for firms when formulating or revising their own business-wide assessments.
Now, this assessment relates specifically to credit institutions operating in Finland. The nature of that sector is that there's a reasonable level of read across to other countries, though, right?
Well, I think so, Graham. As well as domestic banks, it covers international banks operating in Finland through branches or subsidiaries to service personal and corporate customers. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the risk assessment has been informed by data submissions from the institutions themselves through various reporting requirements, from the regulator's direct oversight through supervision of firms, and from the FIU's intelligence as well.
Yeah, but bear in mind the assessment is of money laundering and terrorist financing risks. There's no coverage of proliferation financing, which many firms in the UK particularly will be looking at for the first time this year.
So what can people take from this report, Ray?
Well, first of all, it's a good model of systematic approach to risk assessment across the key aspects, product, geography and so on, that we all need to observe. And in just 10.5 pages as well, so it's worth half an hour of anyone's time to read it in full.
Well, you've convinced me, Ray.
There's also some good tables that risk rate common banking products separately for their money laundering and terrorist financing, which firms can consider to sense check their own comparative assessments.
Well, that sounds extremely handy as well.
But for me, the key learning from this report comes towards the end, where the FSA comments on the effectiveness of monitoring controls in institutions.
So now I'm interested, so you better carry on.
OK, well, they note two important points of great variance between firms, which they believe are correlated. On the one hand, there's the institution's notifications to the FIU.
So like SARS, you mean?
Yes, the report calls out wide variation in the number and quality of submissions, and also draws attention to the key ratio that I always bang on about, which is the ratio of internal to external SARS, and it suggests the risks that either extreme of that ratio, a really big ratio or a really small ratio, might indicate.
Well, that sounds excellent.
Yeah, I thought so. It also talks about scenario-based transaction monitoring too, and suggests that a smaller number of scenarios means the firm has to undertake more manual work, which it says slows down FIU submissions.
Oh, so if I've got you correctly, the suggestion being that fewer scenarios makes transaction monitoring a blunter instrument.
Yeah. And it goes on to speculate that it might fail to take into account the numerous products, services and customer groups sufficiently.
OK, now for me that sounds a bit like a shot across the bows.
Yeah, me too. So what should firms be thinking about based on this, Graham?
For me, Ray, there are two things. First, this seems to be a very clear signal that this regulator, and I suspect probably all of them, will be interested to see how far your transaction monitoring scenarios directly reflect the risks you've identified in your business-wide risk assessment, particularly where you've identified specific product and customer type risks.
Oh, agreed. And the second?
Well, that there'll be a focus on transaction monitoring backlogs because these are seen as impacting on SAR outcomes and quality.
So, all in all, I think this is a bit of a useful update from the Finnish FSA.
Not a sentence I expected to hear from you, but I do think, I completely agree. Actually, this has been a bit of a kind of AOB and any other business episode, hasn't it, Ray?
Well, it has really, Graham, yeah. Hopefully, we've caught people up on some recent developments of note and given them a few things to think about. So, what's next?
Well, as you know, I spent some time recently in the House of Commons giving evidence to a committee of MPs. It was really interesting, and I thought an episode that talks about that a bit, but the role of evidence gathering in the legislative process, and I think it applies not just in the UK but globally, could be really worthwhile.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it.